Please, I need some help.
"Help me, my daughter," he said with his hand quivering as he tried to stretch out both of his hands under the scorching sun. He intended to beckon on Jane with his stretched out hands, but he began almost losing his balance in the process, partly due to his old age and the fact that he had exhausted the little strength in him. He quickly rested on the edge of the well with his head slightly bowed and his hands dangling downwards into the well. One look at him and you would think he had fallen halfway into the well. Jane was returning back from school. She walked slowly, her brown strap sandals barely staying on her feet. The sandals were too big for her tiny feet, and they seemed to announce to the whole world that the faded brown sandal with black patches were not only worn out but probably handed down to her by a person with a foot size that is twice bigger than hers. The truth is, they were not handed down to her, but scavenged by her mother from a huge pile of abandoned worn-out clothes and shoes that were usually heaped close to the town square. Most persons at school made Jane a laughingstock because of her worn-out wares. Jane suddenly raised her head as if jerked by surprise. She had been so engrossed with what had happened at school that she had not even noticed her surroundings. Jane quickly ran to his side to assist him from falling. One look at him and she could tell that the old man was fagged out. She wondered why no one else had tried to help him out, since a lot of students passed by the well on their way home. She made to move him away from the well's side so he does not accidentally fall in. "Help me, my daughter. Water, I need water." His voice was getting fainter and less audible with each word he said. Jane began to panic and scurried to the closest shed to make him a place to rest and regain energy. She moved him to the shed close by and hurried to the well to get him water. She pulled the rope to bring out the bucket from the well with so much passion, one would think she was playing tug-of-war and desperately trying to win. After fetching the water, she used a calabash to scoop water out of the bucket and served the old man. She watched calmly as he gulped the water with compassion in her eyes and continually refilled his calabash till he was satisfied. "Thank you so much, my daughter. God bless you, my daughter. Let me pray for you," he said, looking teary. Jane stared in surprise. All she did was fetch water for him, but he acted as though she had moved mountains. "Baba, it's nothing, but if you insist, no problem." Jane knelt down before him so he could pray, but the old man refused to let her kneel before him. "Stand up, my daughter, stand up. Please don't kneel before me. Who am I?" he said in his weak voice, although his voice had gotten slightly firmer after quenching his thirst. He prayed for her and she offered to help him carry his load home. "No, my daughter, it is too heavy for you." She stared at him and said to herself, "If the load will be too heavy for me, how much more an old man this frail? I cannot let him stress himself. I must help him." Jane picked up the load while ignoring his plea for her to put it down and let him do it by himself. "Papa, please, it will be too heavy for you." She refused to be persuaded or let the old man hurt himself. She had so much compassion in her heart, and she just couldn't let him suffer. As they journeyed, she realized that the man had an unusual glow under the sun. Was the sun just reflecting too brightly on him? All that light was eye-blinding, and Jane decided to look away while simply focusing on the old man's load, which she now carried on her head. They continued walking for a while until the old man took a sudden turn. Jane stood still and thought that something might be strange, but she couldn't place her hands on it. The turn led to a familiar path, In fact, whenever she went hawking, she usually passed that path. "Here, my daughter," the old man said, stopping in front of a hut while signaling Jane to also stop. The hut was small, however it had a unique brown thatched roof which looked newer and much neater than the other ones she had seen, and the smoothness of the mud walls was mind-blowing. She wondered if the walls were actually made of mud like hers, because the walls in the old man's house were slightly glass-like. It was hard to tear her gaze of the walls until she heard the old man cough. "Sorry, Papa." She placed the load carefully in front of the door. "Papa, let me help you carry it inside," Jane offered, but the old man declined while insisting he does it himself. "You must hurry, my daughter. This road gets lonely once it's getting to dusk. Please go and don't return this way once it's dusk." As Jane turned to leave, it suddenly hit her like a bomb was thrown at her face. She realized why she thought it was strange. She had always passed this path. There was no way she had never seen or noticed this small yet conspicuous house. There had to be something deeper, strange yet enchanting. Who is this old man? How is such a beautiful hut suddenly appearing in this familiar path? One would normally not be bothered by the emergence of a new hut, but for Jane it was different. Jane had spent 18 years of her life in the village, and 10 years hawking down that path, so she was dumbfounded that a spot she stopped by the last market day to cry after part of her goods got destroyed at the market had suddenly grown a house. The market day was barely 3 days ago, and building takes much longer in the village, especially a house that prestigious looking. Jane was engrossed deeply in her thoughts as she walked farther and farther away. Each step she took seemed to awaken the dust on the dry ground against her will. She waved her hands to and fro as if she could cage the dusts flying in her face. "A strong wind is likely coming, and it may rain before I get home. Maybe I should go take shed at the old man's house or borrow an umbrella. His place is closer than mine right now," Jane muttered to herself as she quickly hastened her steps back to the old man's house. Was it not here? Jane stared with her eyes bulging out from its socket. She seemed electrified. She could swear that she was standing on the spot where she dropped the load for the old man, and that was the same spot where she left the old man to enter his house. She knew this path like the back of her palm, and she could find her way even in the dark. So where had this old man gone to? The beautiful brown and conspicuous hut too. They had all disappeared? Jane opened her mouth, but words refused to form, and at best she would have spewed a stutter, but she couldn't. The eerily feeling of the environment heightened. Jane remained rooted on the ground as if frozen, too stunned to speak and too frightened to flee. The old man was right. He said the path gets lonely at dusk. She expected the loneliness on the road, but the old man left out a vital part. He never told Jane that it gets busy on the road too, with the market spirit going to trade. Jane had always heard her mother say things like that, but never did she believe such myth. Old tales told to bored children under the udala trees to make them excited. Such things didn't exist to Jane. Why would spirits go to the market? Do they also eat tomatoes like we do? And cry while slicing onions? Does pepper scorch their tongue and leave a burning sensation on their fingers? Do they also pay the young boys to climb up the mango trees and pluck fresh mangoes for sale? Do they pay in cowries or cash, or do they have a currency known to only spirits? Jane had always asked questions and laughed so hard at the end. Stories like that amused Jane so much, and she never understood the horror in the eyes of the little kids who used to join in for moonlight stories. Sooner than later, Jane joined in the horror storytelling. She made the details gorier and had the children gripping one another in fear by the time she was done. The children usually gripped each other by the side. Something about the way Jane told the stories made them too scared to look each other in the eye. But that day, for the first time, Jane had the same horror in her eyes, and she felt a rush of fluid go down her bladder. Jane could hear a distant hooting sound, but she could not decipher where it was coming from. She began to recall the words of the old man. He asked her not to return once it is dusk, but she didn't pay much heed. Every old papa in the village would advise same. "Who is there?" Jane called out as she began to hear footsteps. She sighed a sigh of relief. Maybe someone had decided to take this path even though it was dusk. Perhaps it would be a student like herself who does not pay heed to the old men's tale and superstitious advice, or an old farmer returning from the farm late due to too much work. Either way, Jane desperately needed company. She knew she would not be sought for at home. No one would throw a search party because Jane was missing. They would only gather canes from the herdsmen and wait for her to return late just to unleash the weapons on her. Jane did not mind the beatings anymore. Every lash she got gave her a tougher skin, and she got them quite often. Every time she got stolen from at the market or her goods got destroyed. Every time her clay pot broke. Every time she did not make enough sales. Every time she had not prepared the food early enough. Every time her brothers were too lazy to clean and she refused to step in. The list for Jane was unending. That day, Jane was mentally prepared for the strokes of cane she was to receive when she got back late. What she was not ready for was walking down alone. Jane stood still while she continued waiting for the footsteps to get louder or closer. The more she waited, the more her hope faded away like her mother's Ankara. Her mother's Ankara hated to see water coming because it never remained the same. She never knew who to blame, the ones who made the Ankara with such low quality, or her mother who kept buying the lowest quality fabrics because they were the cheapest. Tears welled up in Jane's eyes. The horror in her eyes gave way for a plea, as if she knew what was about to befall her. As if she was begging some higher being to send help. The sound of the steps got closer, but never close enough, and never too far. It was like an unwanted echo in her ears. She did not want to believe that spirits could possibly thread this path she was familiar with. She chuckled, trying to free herself from the clutches of fear. The day had gotten really dark, and she could see the drizzles even in darkness. More so, she could feel each drop prickle her skin and ignite the creepy feeling she was trying to submerge. The first option of getting shade or even an umbrella from the old man was out of the option. His hut had strangely disappeared from where she last saw it on the path, and he could have been one of the market spirits for all she knew. She turned and made a decision to run home without looking back. She was going to muster every little courage she has and every iota of bravery left in her. If the old man could disappear, who next would be disappearing? Jane's legs were almost touching the back of her head as she ran away from the old man's path. The more she ran, the louder the footsteps got, and the drizzle began to trickle down faster than before. Jane's throbbing heartbeat were getting so loud, one could hear it from a mile away. Fear would only end up attracting what I'm running from, Jane thought as she started running through a muddy path. The mix of water from the rain and the clay made the ground a tussle to pass through. However, Jane was determined to run through. As Jane raised her legs to escape the mud, her oversized sandals seemed to have another plan. The sandals stayed stuck in the mud, and as soon as she tried to free her legs alongside the sandal, she came falling with a great thud. Her face and dress were smeared with the mud. Jane had never regretted doing any good, but as her face came in contact with the sticky mud, a wave of regret flooded her mind. Maybe I should have minded my business. No, I could not have left an old man stranded. Maybe I should not have gone back. Why didn't I follow a different path home? Each question that came to Jane's mind made her burst out crying. Snort flowed freely from her nose as she screamed, crying on the top of her voice while trembling. Jane was not one to easily cry, not even when she had been beaten to stupor. As she continued crying, Jane heard steps, mighty steps that shook the ground close to her. She had not an ounce of strength to run anymore. If it is a beast, let it just devour me. I can't run anymore. She contemplated the options she had in her mind. She could barely look up after she had been covered fully by the mud she fell into. If she stayed still, the beast would probably pass by and not even notice her. She decided to stay still after all. The mud was enough covering for her not to look into the eyes of whatever big beast was before her. Jane's heart stopped beating for a split second when she heard the loudest growl ever heard in her entire life. Jane felt warm liquid flow down her laps. She was so scared that she had peed on herself without knowing. She looked at the feet before her, and she saw a very large furred feet. On a normal day, Jane would think about the prospect in selling furs and how much she could potentially make if her goods are not disturbed by thugs. Jane grew up not just without a silver spoon, but perhaps no spoon at all. She struggled for every penny she got, and she always wanted to see how she could make money from the slightest opportunity. It was how she was hardwired to survive, but that day, Jane could barely see through the mud, and the business prospect was the last thing on the mind of a dying human. All she could think of was help. She tried to scream, but no sound was coming forth from her mouth. She could feel her breath getting stifled. She opened her mouth slightly for airflow, desperately trying to breathe better. She felt a scratch at the back of her throat. She could not hold back the scream anymore. She raised her head, and the beast took a closer step, one that made the floor around her shake. Any wrong move, she felt the ground would open up and give way for the big feet of this big creature. Jane instantly felt huge hands tightly grope her neck. The huge hands roughly held her up. Her legs slowly got lifted from the mud, dangling and kicking the air. Jane knew her end had finally come as beads of sweat formed on her head. Jane was drenched in sweat, but if she ends up unable to free herself from the monster, she could end up drenched in her own blood. Tears flowed freely from her eyes. The tight grip on her neck could only afford her wincing in pain, as she could barely scream out for help anymore. Her pupils began to dilate. Her legs no longer struggled for freedom but came to a slow pause, and Jane was one step away from exiting the land of the living. She was dying. Just about to give up the ghost. Jane may have thought of 1,000 ways to die, but she never knew this was how her end would come. Suddenly, a flash of light appeared. The type that didn't seem ephemeral or of this world. The light grew brighter. She could not open her eyes. Jane heard huge steps, making the ground under her tremble. The steps were not coming closer. They were moving away rapidly and fading into a distant noise. It hit her. The monster was running away. The bright light scared him. She had not even realized that the monster loosened his grip on her neck. Everything happened so fast. Jane looked around, wondering where the blind light had come from and how the monster had laid her down so softly without her even realizing. What bright light is this? How did it chase away the monster? Jane thought to herself. She dared stare at the blinding light, and she could see a being. A frame that made it look like he was surrounded by fire, standing tall and glowing. Jane raised her left arm over her face to shield her eyes from getting blinded, her elbow in the air while deepening her face into the crook of her arms. Out of the light someone emerged. Jane slowly lifted her face, still trembling and visibly shaken. She watched the frame in the glowing fire, and her mouth fell agape. She could not close it if she tried. She had never been more surprised in her entire life. Papareya, she screamed ecstatically. It was the old man she helped earlier. He had emerged from the light. It was him all along.